Hi, my name is Mike Kennedy from GreenCheck Verified, the cannabis banking solution. Cannabis businesses face unique challenges when confronted with economic difficulties and financial challenges in an industry suffering from a lack of institutionalized capital. Since marijuana remains federally illegal, bankruptcy court protection is denied to plant touching and, in some circumstances, ancillary companies. Our panel will discuss the judicial and non-judicial options for operators, secured creditors, investors, and other stakeholders, including a look at the proposed receivership process for cannabis operators to be implemented in Massachusetts.
Good morning, everybody. I think we're populating slowly. Oh, there we go. Great. So, unfortunately, we have to follow the commissioner and his interview with Frank Siegel, my partner. But I think this will be very informative, very interesting, and extremely timely given what's going on in the industry. Welcome to Restructuring and Workouts in the Cannabis Industry. Let me quickly introduce my honored panelists. In no particular order, Cynthia Romano is the Global Director of CohnReznick's Restructuring Dispute Resolution Practice. She has over 30 years of experience in performance improvement, turnaround management, transaction support, and investment analysis. She has won Top Female CEO. She's the winner of the TMA, Turnaround Management Association Global Mid-Sized Company Turnaround of the Year, and co-winner of the TMA Northeast Small Company Turnaround of the Year. Also joining us is Patrick Ryder, who's Senior Vice President at Hub International. Patrick has over 19 years of experience in customer service and client development. He consults with organizations in North America and internationally, and with respect to insurance and risk programs and risk management techniques and how they relate to the management of professional and cyber liability exposures. I just call Patrick my D&O guru, so that might be a better way to acknowledge him. Also with us is Jacques Sentucci, president of Nucleus One Consulting, which is a business performance management firm specializing in the cannabis industry. His team helps clients around the country navigate the complex and evolving challenges of starting, operating, and turning around a cannabis business. Also with us is Charlie Alivicetti from Vicente Cedarburg, where he's a partner there and head of their firm's corporate department. He has been recognized by Chambers and Partners, one of the top cannabis lawyers in the United States. His practice focuses on advising investors, companies, and other law firms on the nuances of these complex corporate transactions in the ever-evolving cannabis industry. And finally, John Brecker. John is the managing partner at Altitude Investment Management. Altitude Investment Management is a venture capital fund investing in the legal marijuana market. John has over 30 years of experience investing in stressed and bankrupt companies. So thank you, my honored guests, my panelists. So let's just jump right into it. Cannabis. We saw this initial video to start this. The green rush. There's more liquidity. Allegedly recession-proof. As Commissioner Hoffman said, in Massachusetts, we already have 77 retailers open, none of whom had to close when the adult use market here did have to close for a period of time due to COVID. So why are we having this panel? I mean, is this premature? Why are we talking about distress and workouts? Jacques, why don't you start?
I knew you would start with me.
Of course.
That's a good question. And actually, you and I, we've been talking about this for the past 3-4 years, that it will happen one day. So personally, I've been working in the cannabis industry for over 10 years now, when we started Wellness Connection in Maine, and then started our consulting practice working with investors, entrepreneurs, and operations around the country, and a lot of them in Massachusetts. And what we've seen is people will reach out to us because they want to plan and they want to understand what the opportunity is. And most of them usually start not being too realistic. And what we've seen is companies or people starting companies not being realistic about the cost, the initial cost, the capital that they need, and then for sure about the opportunity. And at some point, the reality meets the dream, and the dream is not there.
I mean, Charlie, I know you have lots of clients,
and so I think that's why
Vicente Cederberg in the industry. Question for you is, I mean, what are you seeing? I mean, is this? I know you're a corporate lawyer. You're about deals. I mean, are we premature to have this conversation today?
I'm not going to say it's premature, but I think that, you and I had this conversation, when COVID sort of started, there was a concern that we were going to see, a tremendous uptick in restructuring work, and that we were going to see a lot of people facing financial distress. I don't think that the volume of distress that we were worried might occur has happened, but, it doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. And I think that, in any industry, there are going to be winners and losers, right? So even if the industry remains on a strong tick, you're still going to have to consider, think about restructuring in a heavily regulated and licensed business. You got to think about what happens to what probably the most valuable asset of the business, right? What happens to their license in a restructuring situation?
And Cynthia, I know your practice is nationwide, and I know you all are starting to see some distress in the industry. What exactly are you seeing? Just in terms of trends or in terms of work?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me here today. We're pleased to be a sponsor and very excited to participate in this. So what we are seeing is, like many businesses, cash becomes a challenge. And for cannabis companies, it's even more of a challenge because access to capital is not nearly as varied. In fact, it's fair to say it's difficult to identify and place capital for these companies. Additionally, when many companies were able to avail themselves of the stimulus money, which is why we believe we haven't seen the wave of restructuring yet that everyone had talked about, the stimulus essentially propped up companies, even if they were showing losses, even if demand was significantly down. But the stimulus money made it possible for the companies to continue to operate. Cannabis companies, particularly the direct ones, were not eligible for the funding either through the PPP program and the SBA or any of the other stimulus money that was available in other industries because of the fact that they are not legal on a federal level. So what we have seen in terms of distress in the industry is liquidity constraints. For most companies in any industry, that's usually where the problem starts. There's been some operational or financial issue that leads to a hiccup in liquidity, cash gets tight, and then from there, there's a cascade of events that takes place that ultimately leads to a distressed situation.
So, I mean, that sounds to me, so I've been a turnaround restructuring professional for way too long, and you and I have both worked together in this industry, certainly with PMA, but that just sounds to me like the industry, the question, I guess, is what particular in the cannabis industry, is there anything particular about cannabis other than it being federally illegal per se that is, going to be a cause of distress in the future? Like, for instance, 280E.
Right. So, look, I think there are a number of issues, right? You have to start with, can you get working capital? And the answer is it's difficult. There are more options coming online. The credit unions are starting to participate. But in the true sense of the word, working capital loans are not truly available. So if you start with the fact that every business needs capital and it's difficult to get, it starts there. So that is different from other industries. Then you have the vagaries of growing, right? Even though a lot of it's done indoors in most states, you still have the challenges that confront any agriculture business, any farming business, where if it's outside, you've got weather-related and pest-related issues. If it's inside, you've got how well things are set up and are things growing properly. So that just adds a whole other layer of complexity. And then, like many businesses, distribution and outlet locations and outlet channels are how do you get to the consumer, which has been a particular problem during COVID. So those are some of the things that I see as unique to this industry that don't necessarily plague other industries.
So John, you come from a different perspective in the sense, I mean, you've been in the industry, the turnaround industry, doing strategic acquisitions. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, do you have are you seeing opportunities in the market due to distress? Is it time to even be talking about this with you and Altitude, or?
So the market's bifurcated. I think it's the have and have-nots. Companies that are public, the larger MSOs, if you've watched what's happened over the last month, they've been doing drive-bys and raising capital. The medium to smaller private companies are still having difficulty raising capital, and we definitely have an opportunity to dictate terms. And so it creates a good opportunity for those with capital. Where when the bubble was bursting, there were crazy valuations. The valuations are much more realistic now. Terms are much more realistic, and it's difficult for small to medium-sized companies right now to raise private capital. There's no institutional money in the industry at this point, and there is, some family offices or funds like ourselves or our high net worth individuals, but this industry needs a lot of capital to grow. It needs a lot of CapEx dollars to build out the infrastructure, and until true institutional money comes into place, that's going to be one of the limitations to this industry. And everyone on this Zoom today is waiting to see what happens next week with, the elections. And does the regulatory environment change that permits institutional capital to come into this industry? So yes, we are seeing numerous opportunities every single day to invest capital in different size companies along the whole, from ancillary to growers to MSOs. So there's an abundance of opportunities for investors and to dictate terms.
That's great. So Patrick, you come from this from a different perspective in the sense that you're talking with CEOs, CFOs about various professional liability policies, whatnot, which could be extremely expensive. What are you hearing? Are the CEOs, CFOs you're talking with concerned? Are they concerned as we are, or is it kind of head in the sand? I'm just curious, you might have a different perspective on all of this.
Yeah, I think we actually see quite a mixed bag. I think you've got some guys that definitely have their head in the sand. They see the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but that marker keeps moving a little bit. And then you've got other individuals that say, listen, this is reality. Money is drying up, and we have to either divest assets, which might, violate the terms of our private placement memorandums, could go against our listing agreements, and it creates liability not only on the organization but on the individuals themselves. And that's what I kind of focus on, is where the liability sits and how we can address that through risk transfer. It's expensive, and the reason why is that a lot of guys are getting sued right now. I think the latest numbers are out from one of the major carriers in the D&O market, where 60% of the policies that they issued in 2019 have been noticed with a claim. That's an astonishingly high number.
How does that compare to the non-cannabis industry? Just out of curiosity.
If you look at the overall marketplace, right now we're somewhere between 8 and 12% of policies getting noticed, and the loss ratios are trending that way. If you look at London was writing public company D&O at about 140% loss ratio. So they stopped writing it. They couldn't make any money. In the cannabis industry, that number is creeping up. Last year was about 92%. And we anticipate that the 2019 numbers, as they as losses kind of earn over time, will eclipse the 100% marker here very shortly.
Wow. Well, let's turn to what we in the workout turnaround profession can do and help these companies for a little bit, and let's separate to non-judicial, remedies or exercises and judicial. Let's start with the non-judicial, and it seems to me a lot of these MSOs are selling off assets, and part of it is it was the 2018 was the big land grab. Now it's about consolidation, focusing more on operational teams as opposed to how many stores you have in how many states. But actually today, I Forefront announced they were doing a sale leaseback with Innovative Industrial, which is a REIT. I guess my question is this a sustainable strategy for the MSOs? I mean, they're selling off licenses. Yes, they're getting a nice infusion of cash, but they're entering into leases. I mean, aren't they just kicking the can? Which I know is what we love to do in the workout world at times.
Well,
but
I think
yes, please.
I think your comment is a little bit too global, because I don't think it's the case for everybody. I mean, when you talk about MSOs, you see, those public companies like Forefront or Curaleaf, and then you've got those MSOs that are private companies that are expanding and then a little bit under the radar, more or less. And then you've got, smaller companies that are just trying to create their small business in their region. I don't think we can put them all in the same bucket. What I've seen in the past few years, and to refer to what you just said about the land grab, is it's deal making. Those people were not trying to build a company off the talent or off their employees or often a business opportunity for the long term. They were, to my opinion, is they were just trying to make deals and try to create a deal that they maybe could benefit from. And some of them got caught and it just didn't work. And the land grab, I mean, MedMen probably is one of them. The land grab just didn't work. But then there's some other companies that are have different strategies, and they have a long-term strategy that is around talent, around products, or around quality, and I think those companies, we won't have to worry too much about them as long as they can secure the capital. I think the one we're going to see in trouble is the one that are just not they're just thinking about today. They're not thinking about the future.
I would add that what I'm seeing is, of course, the cash liquidity has dried up, and that raising capital has become much more difficult. Companies have become much more focused on operations and becoming cash flow break even, so that they have a runway to operate. And also, what you're seeing when the bubble was happening, it was anybody trying to get in the cannabis space. Now we're having better operators come into the space that have more experience and know how to operate. So these companies are performing better, and they're also maturing. With this industry, when it started 3 years ago, there was no industry. Now we're starting to have companies that have had a number of grows and have built out their infrastructure and have built out core employees. So we're seeing the next stage of growth. And so we're going to see, and this industry, as we said before, is bifurcating. There are the companies that are succeeding, and there are the companies that are not able to execute and are running out of liquidity. And those are the companies that are up for sale, that are consolidating, that are going out of business, where the companies that are executing have opportunities to grow throughout the United States, throughout the world. And that's what we're seeing at Altitude.
And if I can just jump in here, I think it's really important, the comment that was made about the industry being so new. If you look across all industries, and when an industry comes into play, and tech is one of the most recent examples, particularly if you look back to the .com era, you had a race to market. Everybody with a crazy idea, everybody with any idea raced in. So there were all of these small companies. Then the more successful ones started to consolidate and to buy, and the land grab that you talked about. And then they integrated horizontally, and then they consolidated, and then they integrated vertically, and then they split apart. And then a bunch of them died and new ones came to being. And I think what you're seeing with this industry is a fairly fast forward view of what's happened in other industries as people try and get ahead of where is this going? How do I make money here? Where can capital be deployed and for what benefit? And what are models that work? Because it's so new, I think everybody is still trying out to figure out what are the models that will work here and what ultimately produces yield. But as noted, when things don't work, and you saw it in the tech industry, there will be companies that don't make it. There will be companies that sell. There will be ones that simply die and go away. And I think that's not atypical of what we might expect as the industry goes in pretty fast forward motion from 0 to 100 miles an hour.
So, no, thank you. And I agree with you. Now, at the risk of insulting Jacques and Cynthia, when I think of turnarounds in my simple head, I like to divide them. If you're going to go in and turn around a company, I look at sort of financial restructuring and operational restructuring. And I know that's oversimplifying it, but just bear with me. And it seems to me there's very little opportunities for financial restructuring in the cannabis industry. I mean, it's not like you have you can go refi your debt or you really have any type of leverage or there's abundance of other institutional money there. So it seems to me operational restructuring is going to be, at least for the time being, the way this industry goes. So Cynthia and Jacques, I know you've served as CROs or chief restructuring officers many times past. My question to you is, if you were, and I understand it depends how big the company is and there's so many factors, but just generally, if you were hired to be a chief restructuring officer, CRO, FA, for one of these cannabis companies, and maybe we'll say like a SSO versus MSO, what would you do? What were the first couple of things you would look at or try to, achieve or do?
So I'll start if it's okay, Jacques, and feel free to jump in and we'll make this a conversation. So by the time a CRO is appointed, usually things are fairly bad, right? It means somebody has an interest in having an independent party take a look, be in charge, and take control. So the way we think about, generally speaking, phases of companies and phases of turnarounds are, first there is the now, which is triage. Then there's next, which is improve. And then there's new, which is how do you renew, regrow, transform, et cetera. In the triage phase, the 3 C's are what govern: cash, communication, and control. And cash. Really, cash is first, second, and third. But at the end of the day, more has to come in than goes out. I don't care what industry you're in. I don't care what business you're in. I don't care what it is that you do to make money. If you do not have cash to operate, you can't pay payroll. You can't pay for your trade. You can't pay any debt service or any capital service that you've got. So at the end of the day, as a CRO, first and foremost is what is the cash position? How much do you have? How long is it likely to last? And how do you extend that runway? Quickly on its heels is communication, which is making sure that key stakeholders, and that is both external and internal, both are communicated to transparently so that you can get cooperation as much as possible from all the various stakeholders. And then lastly is control. What are the metrics that make this business go? And what are the things that will allow you to do less, to do more with less? And if you go back to the cash question, and it ties into your sales question, it ties into, is this a knee-jerk reaction to just sell off assets? The question of cash is, in a triage situation, I don't care what you have to do, but you've got to get cash in and you have to extend runway. Otherwise, there's no way to do anything else. And whether that means stopping payments to trade, whether that means headcount reduction, whether that means sell off of non-core assets, in some cases even core assets if you need to raise money, those things become the most critical thing you have to do first. in order to create the runway for the rest of the changes that you might want to implement to happen. There are other things you can do, but they usually take a little bit of time, and sometimes they take some cash. So to me, the 3 C's become the most critical thing as a CRO to look at, with a very, very, very first focus on cash and extending runway.
Jacques, thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I don't have much to add. I think I would agree. And I think one of the things I've seen in the cannabis industry is the lack of control on the expenses, and everybody's focusing on sales. But like Cynthia was saying, you got to have more in that you get out, and nobody, we all seen all those examples of MSOs or smaller groups that are spending money like there's no tomorrow, and not hiring the right talent, not focusing on the right thing. And interestingly, and Scott, I've been spending years on this. Nobody's talking about the cost of production. We're all focusing on sales, but there's not enough knowledge and not enough standards on the cost of goods. And I think that's gonna be one of the issue with what we're talking about here is people have to produce less for better quality. So on top of what Cynthia is saying, I think looking at the expense structure.
Yeah, from a very basic tactical perspective, you do a walk down the P&L, every single line item. Where can more cash come in? Where can we protect cash from going out? And then you do the same thing. You walk down the balance sheet. Where might I generate some cash for some assets? Where might I conserve cash on some of my liabilities? And it is a very tactical exercise to figure out how to extend cash runway.
So speaking of cash and even more cash, so we'll just call that the 3 C's. Patrick, let me turn to you for a second, because in many ways, D&O liability, it is a cash outlay when people get sued, obviously. It's a cash outlay to buy D&O policies to the extent they actually cover anything in the industry. But also, it could potentially be an asset in certain circumstances. I wonder if you might just be able to just give us a little snapshot of what is going on with respect to the D&O market, given that it is many times, could be the only asset of the estate or the business.
So I think the point here is cash is king, right? The more you've got, the more you're able to do. And in the current D&O environment, we're looking at rates somewhere in the neighborhood of 17.5% to 25%, which means for $1 million worth of coverage, you're paying between $175,000 and $250,000. That's an astronomical amount of premium to be paying, and the return is something that CFOs really look at. So right now in the industry, we're creating options whereby companies that have cash can actually take ownership of their own risk management programs. So whether that's creating a irrevocable trust, I can't stand that word, or perhaps creating a captive scenario. And even companies without cash can kind of get there by using stock in certain ways. And there are levers that you can pull that don't involve necessarily outlaying that $1 million for a $5 million policy. You can build a significant tower that stands outside the entity and really protects the directors and officers. And these are the conversations that we're having with CEOs and CFOs that say, listen, my personal assets are at stake here for the way that I choose to run the company, the way that the board works together. Let's take a look at how we can best protect those without paying these rates and creating, I think, a long-term plan, not just a short-term window, which is where I think a lot of companies that get into this really struggle. Again, the focus on today as opposed to the tomorrow. If you've got a 3-year plan on these things, it can really be beneficial.
So let's just turn for a little bit to sort of the judicial end of restructuring, and as we all know, because cannabis is federally illegal, your cannabis company cannot file for Chapter 11 can't file for under any chapter of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. In Canada, they can, but it's a different story. it seems to me, there are other remedies, some assignment for benefit of creditors, which I think has limited utility. It seems like the state court receivership may be really the best sort of judicial proceeding in which to. I mean, I don't think there's much reorganizing, but it's more on sort of sales and liquidation. I know in Massachusetts, we are adapting new regulations with respect to receiverships. Charlie, can you just give us a rundown? Because I think it's going to be important for the industry and kind of compare it to what's going out west, which I know you've been involved in.
Yeah, so, just at a high level, so we currently have draft regulations for a receivership system in Massachusetts. That's not me. We were expecting those to be finalized. Originally I was thinking that those were going to be finalized this week, but with the delivery license comment period being extended, it's probably not going to happen until November 30th at the earliest. But to just give everyone a quick overview of what the rules say. So, the issue in Massachusetts is that you cannot operate a licensed business unless the CCC has determined you to be permissible to control it. And the change of control process in Massachusetts can be quite lengthy. It can take 5 to 8 months. So obviously in a insolvency type scenario, that's far too long for anything to happen. So they've added these rules that allow a receiver pursuant to a court order to take control of the business. You have to provide notice to the CCC immediately when it happens. There's a list of pre-approved receivers that they're going to have. So if you're on that list, you're good to go. If you're not on that list, within 2 days, you have to file an application with the CCC. And they have explicitly delegated authority to the executive director to deal with this vetting process, because the idea is hopefully that speeds it up so it can occur sort of on a timeline that works for these businesses. Receivers are subject to the same limitations as other licensees. And the big one that they highlight in the rules is the license cap. So you couldn't be a receiver and have a financial interest in more than 3 licenses of any type. So they're particularly focused on that license cap. But the challenge, what we'll see is, the rules as they are right now don't address, and I don't think they can address, how host community agreements come into play. So in Massachusetts, like some states, there is a local licensing component. So under the rules, they can transfer the state license, but if you needed to assign that host community agreement to a new entity as part of the restructuring process, you're going to have to work with the town in question. And how that interplays with the court and then the CCC, I think is one thing to pay attention to as we go forward.
Well, the one thing that seems to me troubling in the whole scenario of receiverships, and I'm sure the rest of the panel will probably agree. So as you know, if a company is pushed into a receivership, it's usually the creditors or some other stakeholder filing a petition. And generally there's exigent circumstances, financial distress, payment coming up, rent payment. And, when you go to court, it's not as if you will say, okay, Your Honor, we need a receiver, but let's wait a month and a half until the receiver is approved. And yes, I know they're trying to shorten the process here with the regulators in terms of approval, but I can't imagine they're going to approve someone in a day or two. I don't know if the panel has any thoughts on that, or Charlie, if you do. I just think it's, from my experience, being involved in state court receiverships across the country, it just seems as if the regulations and the regulators just aren't necessarily in tune to the practicalities of how these proceedings work.
Listen, I think mine is tedious. Mine is tedious.
So Scott, this is Cynthia. While he's getting his microphone sorted out, I think As you said, the courts aren't necessarily well equipped to handle the vagaries of the stress, right? Bankruptcy courts have some unique setups in terms of speed and what it's required, and very well established documentation for day one, day two, et cetera. But I do think that while this industry cannot avail itself of, at presently, of Chapter 11 or Chapter 7 proceedings, that's not necessarily a terrible thing, right? We use it as a hammer and a threat to, generally speaking, in other industries, but the majority of times we do these cases out of court. And while the threat of bankruptcy helps corral and herd the cats, the reality is it's far more to actually wind up to work that out of court. And it's good old blocking and tackling. It's helping creditors see what is what their options are, what the bad case and what the good case would be, and helping them see that what we're working towards is the good case as a reason to cooperate. Some of the largest cases I've done have been creditors corralled out of court. And in this, with this industry, it's no different. You've got to get people to get on board with the idea that the worst case is bad for everybody. And as a result, they want to follow along with a plan that makes things better for them as opposed to worse. That being said, you talked about assignment for the benefit of creditors and ABC. It's a state court proceeding, but it's solely for liquidating purposes. So that, or perhaps a sale purpose, but more often liquidation. And the receivership is an option, but as you said, it's slow. So I think what we're looking at is what the turnaround industry used to be before all the restructuring of the bankruptcy regulations, and just good old-fashioned turnaround workout blocking to get everybody on board with maybe a solution they don't love, but one that's significantly better than the alternatives.
Like the good old days when we did compositions. Is that?
Yeah, right. So you basically run when we've done this, you essentially run a bankruptcy proceeding process outside of court. You set it up the same. You have an automatic stay. You pick a petition date. You get all the creditors and you say, this is what we're doing and this is how long it's going to take. And we're going to transparently communicate so that you have the same information you would. And you get a creditors committee, as it were, together. And you let that creditors committee have a significant input into the plan. And I think that, as you said, it's the good old days in terms of what we used to do is now something that can be used for companies in this space.
I would add.
Oh, please, John, go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, Article 9 is tedious. Each state has a different regulatory environment, and you have to understand the regulations in each state. But more importantly, Article 9 is used when you have a secured position. There, A, is not that much debt in the companies that are operating the cannabis space. But B, your collateral is usually the best collateral you have is a license. And I'll look to you, Scott, are licenses assignable and how are they assignable? I think that's an important point because your other collateral, maybe it's land that has value, but farm equipment, the grows, it's de minimis in value. So, I agree that, the threat of Article 9 is more important to bring you to negotiate than the actual execution currently of Article 9. So that's my point.
So Charlie, I'll let you jump in on sort of the transferability of license issues. Certainly in Massachusetts, if you want to kind of opine there.
Yeah,
left.
Yeah, I would say that in my mind, there's two issues, right? One is a question of whether you can collateralize a license at all. Mm-hmm. A lot of the regulations are silent on that, and if you ask regulators, you get a range of answers that may or may not be tied to the rules of the statutes at all. But we've seen some states have prohibited certain types of collateral. Some states it's changing, but some states have prohibited securing it with cannabis itself. Though I haven't really seen anyone address licenses specifically. The second issue is that if you're actually going to try and do an Article 9 action with respect to a licensed asset, be it the license or the marijuana cannabis, you have to go through the regulators, and it's going to be a huge hassle. Changing control of a license in Massachusetts, like I said, it can take 5 to 8 months. So 5 to 8 months later, there might not be anything of value.
Right. Good point.
So,
But I want to turn back to John for a second. So bankruptcy, for the most part these days, and again, I'll make a gross generalization, but it's really a 363 play. I mean, how many companies actually go in and restructure these days with an actual Chapter 11 plan? Obviously, a 363 sale order is the best sale order you can get. All the old adages. But John, when you're looking at maybe acquisitions, have you or Altitude ever looked at acquiring assets through a receivership? Granted, there's not that many yet, but Michigan just passed its own receivership statute like maybe a few weeks ago. And I would imagine you may start seeing that as more of a liquidation way to sell, your assets through a judicial process, and get some money for return for the creditors, whether secured, unsecured, and then maybe equity. But I'm just wondering what your thinking is, and whether it's even worth it to you to even go bid at one of these, receiver sales.
So you've seen it in the CBD space much more than you have in the, cannabis space. CBD is able to go through true restructuring businesses, and there have been a number of 363 sales. In THC, no, really have not seen a judicial process. It's really been negotiated, one-off negotiations with attorneys on potential purchases of assets in a distressed company. Will that change over time? Likely, as this industry becomes more sophisticated, larger, and most importantly, the legalization changes. We'll see, definitely more opportunities through judicial process, but not now.
I mean, the good thing too is with hemp and CBD.
The size of the company.
No, please go ahead, Jacques. My bad.
I was saying the size of the company. Yeah, the size of the company is going to also get bigger and bigger, right? Because just in Massachusetts, 2 years ago, they were just small businesses just starting, but now they're operational. They got 3 or 4 stores. They've got massive cultivation, and one of them fell. There's a lot more at stake. I think it's going to change also the way we negotiate or the way we look at those deals.
I was just going to say, with respect to hemp and CBD, to follow up on John's point, because of the 2018 Farm Bill, now that it is legal in certain contexts, and that's our next panel actually, so that's a good segue. But we have seen hemp-related bankruptcies, so Gencana or a few others, and they're like any other normal bankruptcy. I believe Gencana's assets were sold through a 363. There might have been some attempts at credit bidding because there was secured debt. And I'm just wondering, so once bankruptcy is available, and let's just assume it'll be soon enough, I mean, how will that impact the industry? Are we going to see, 363 cannabis deals?
Definitely.
Anyone.
But we need legalization to happen. And I'm sure that's a different topic, but before you have 363 sales, you need legalization. The Bankruptcy Code has a lot of good uses, as everyone on this panel knows, and certainly, if cannabis is legalized, bankruptcy will be used as a tool to make acquisitions, to sell off assets, to clean your balance sheet. So I think it's unfortunate that it's not available to this industry at this time, because it'd make it a lot easier to purchase assets.
Well, and everything really.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. My bad.
No, I was going to say everything comes down to legalization, right? The 280E problem, the ability to utilize bankruptcy, the Bankruptcy Code, access to capital, particularly through regulated banks. There are a number of things that flow from the legalization to this industry that this industry is currently hampered by.
I mean, it seems to me once legalization comes, or there's some type of legislative change to the IRS code, 280E has hindered many businesses. The IRS has announced there's creating special audit teams. I know, Jacques, you've looked into this, especially with your days when you were working with Wellness of Maine and other places. I mean, how big of an impact is or has been 280E on the economic viability of many of these cannabis companies?
Well, yeah, no, and I see it already still now when we work with a new client and we work on the financial model and we have to, and even more with recreational, with medical, we had some tax strategies that we could put in place to mitigate the impact. But for recreational, and particularly with people who just have a store and no production, the impact of 280Es is big. And we see it when we work on the financial model and we announce to them that on the second year of operation, although they're going to make money, they're not going to make money much. They're going to have to pay a lot of taxes. And it goes back to our initial comments, lack of planning, lack of capital. And then that's how after a couple of years in business, you don't take into account all those things that can happen, and 280E, puts you in trouble.
Although I do want to say, though, I want to make sure it's clear that eradication of 280E is not, I don't think is going to be this this panacea to the industry. I mean, it will help with cash flow, cash going to what Cynthia started with. But, I still think we'll still see a need for all of us on this panel in one way or the other. I don't know if anyone else has a thought on that.
I do. I think you're right. I mean, listen, 280E is hurting cash flow of certain operators within this industry. But generally, cannabis is a commodity. And at some point, we're going to have more abundance of cannabis being grown than demand. So there's going to be more supply. So these companies are going to need to be efficient operators. There's going to be a much more competitive marketplace. And that isn't the case now in the industry. It will be in the future. And, the companies are going to be able to have to operate as a commodity, tight margins and, be cash flow positive. But we're not really we're starting to see companies be cash flow positive, but not many. And in order for this industry to continue to grow and expand, companies got to mature and execute and be profitable.
Yeah, I think to that point,
I agree.
280E will be nice.
And
280E will be nice, and it'll help folks that are good operators. Bad operators will be bad operators.
Right.
Right. And to the extent that
I agree 200%. I think,
Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
Go ahead, Cynthia. Sorry.
No.
So the banking is the number one thing to resolve, because that would help, the industry to stabilize. I would say that 280E is obviously on the top, but the control on cost and like what John was saying about the commodity is very important. Executing and then reducing the cost, and so that the margin can be pretty good these days. At $4,000 a pound on wholesale, but at the end, it's the days are counted where it become a commodity. And people have to produce for less than $1.25 a gram. Otherwise, they will head in the wall.
So I am getting the hook from our team. But I just want to say, I've had these conversations, I think, with all of you privately. And now we've had this ability somewhat with Zoom to have these conversations. I think it's just the beginning, but I want to thank all of you for agreeing to spend some time with me. And I'm going to thank all of you in the future to have these conversations, because I think we're all going to be working together a bit in the next few years as this industry grows, but also matures, which always brings all of us into play. So thank you again. And what we're going to do next is we're going to another 10-minute break. And then we're going to return with our hemp and CBD panel. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.